The sun hung mercilessly overhead, a blazing white eye in a cloudless sky. The heat shimmered in waves off the endless dunes, turning the horizon into a distorted mirage. Mark wiped the sweat from his forehead, but it was useless. His skin was already drenched, his throat painfully dry. The trip was supposed to be an adventure, a solo drive through the vast desert, testing his endurance, pushing his limits. He had prepared, or so he thought. His backpack had enough water for a couple of days, a satellite phone, emergency supplies. But one mistake was all it took. His Jeep had hit a hidden rock, sending him skidding off course. The impact blew out his front tires, and the sudden lurch sent his bag flying out of the vehicle. By the time he crawled out, dizzy and bruised, the sandstorm had already begun to rise on the horizon. In minutes, everything changed. The storm roared like a living beast, swallowing everything in its path. Mark barely managed to cover his face before the world turned into a choking, blinding storm of sand. He stumbled through it, arms outstretched, trying to find his backpack. The one thing that held his survival. It was gone. By the time the storm passed, his Jeep was half buried, useless without spare tires, and his supplies had vanished into the endless desert. The satellite phone, the extra water, everything he needed. He was alone. The desert stretched around him in every direction, miles of nothing. No signs of civilization, no roads, no landmarks. His only option was to walk, find water, find help. But the nearest town was at least a day's journey away, if he was even heading in the right direction. With no other choice, Mark turned toward the horizon and began walking, his boots sinking into the burning sand. Every step felt heavier than the last. Hours passed. The sun burned his skin. His mouth was so dry it hurt to swallow. The wind whispered through the dunes, an eerie, hollow sound. How long before he collapsed? Before he became just another skeleton buried by the shifting sands? Then, out of the corner of his eye, movement. Mark stopped, his pulse quickening. Something was there, watching him. A shadow against the dunes, a pair of eyes, bright, sharp, and unblinking. Mark blinked, unsure if the eyes staring at him were real or just another trick of the desert. He squinted through the heat haze, trying to focus. A creature stood atop a nearby dune, watching him. At first, he thought it was a coyote, maybe a jackal, but as it stepped forward, its form became clearer, a sand-colored dog. Its lean body and sharp, intelligent eyes told him it was no ordinary stray. It looked like a desert survivor, a creature built for this harsh world. Mark took a cautious step forward, his cracked lips parting. "Hey, you lost too?" His voice came out hoarse, barely more than a whisper. The dog didn't move. It just stared. Mark exhaled and shook his head. He had bigger problems. A mirage wasn't going to save him. He turned away and kept walking, his legs screaming with each step. His body was weakening fast, too fast. But then, footsteps. Mark looked over his shoulder. The dog was following him, not approaching, not running away, just keeping pace. Something about it sent a shiver down his spine. Why was it following him? Was it waiting for him to collapse? Or did it know something he didn't? Another hour passed. The sun hung lower, but the air still felt like fire. Mark's throat was raw, his limbs sluggish. He wasn't going to last much longer. Then suddenly, the dog ran ahead. Mark frowned, watching as it darted between the dunes, then stopped and turned back, staring at him expectantly. It let out a single sharp bark. "What is it?" Mark muttered, his voice barely audible. His feet dragged forward, drawn by some unseen force. The dog trotted ahead, stopping every few moments, waiting for him, leading him. Mark hesitated. Was he really about to follow a stray dog through the desert? Did he have a choice? Clenching his jaw, he forced his legs to move. Step by step, he followed the dog. Mark's feet felt like they were made of lead. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, his body screaming for rest, for water, for relief that didn't exist. The only thing keeping him moving was the dog. It padded ahead of him, weaving through the dunes with effortless grace, pausing just enough to make sure he was still following. There was purpose in its movements. Mark didn't know why, but he trusted it. Then his knee buckled. He collapsed onto the scorching sand, his breath ragged. The heat pressed down on him like a crushing weight. His vision blurred, dark spots dancing at the edges. The dog barked. A sharp, urgent sound. Mark forced his eyes open. Through his haze, he saw the animal standing atop a nearby dune, staring at him. It barked again, then began digging furiously into the sand. Mark groaned. What? What are you doing? The dog didn't stop. It dug faster, sand flying behind it. Mark's mind was too fogged with dehydration to think straight, but something in him stirred. With a painful grunt, he dragged himself forward. His fingers sank into the warm sand where the dog was digging. Weakly, he clawed at the earth, his breath ragged. Then, his hand touched something cool. Wet sand. His heart pounded. Desperation took over as he dug faster, ignoring the pain in his fingers. And then, water. A tiny, hidden pool just beneath the surface. Not much, but enough. Mark didn't hesitate. He scooped up the muddy water with shaking hands and drank. It was warm, grainy, but he didn't care. It saved him. The dog watched silently as he drank, its amber eyes unwavering. When he finally pulled back, gasping for air, he looked at the animal with something new in his gaze. Gratitude, respect, maybe even awe. You knew, he whispered, his voice cracked but full of realization. You led me here. The dog sat down, panting lightly as if saying, Of course I did. Mark exhaled and sat back. His body still ached, and he was far from safe, but for the first time since the accident, he had a chance, and he wasn't alone. The night fell swiftly over the desert, bringing with it an eerie silence. The once scorching sand turned cold, the wind whispering through the dunes like distant voices. Mark huddled beside the dog, his body still weak but fueled by the small victory of finding water. But survival wasn't guaranteed. Not yet. His next challenge was the cold. Without fire or shelter, the temperature drop was just as deadly as the heat. Mark curled in on himself, shivering violently. The dog, sensing his struggle, moved closer, pressing its warm body against his side. It wasn't much, but it was something. Guess we're in this together, huh? Mark murmured, barely keeping his eyes open. The dog flicked its ears but didn't move away. Morning came, and with it a renewed determination. Mark had to find help. His body still ached, his throat still dry, but the water had given him just enough strength to push forward. And the dog? It led the way. Mile after mile they walked. The sun returned with its unforgiving heat, but Mark followed his unlikely guide, trusting it with his life. Then, just as his strength threatened to fail again, he saw it. A road. His heart nearly stopped. It was cracked and worn, but unmistakable, a path carved by civilization. And just beyond it, in the wavering heat, a truck. Mark stumbled forward, waving frantically. His voice was too weak to call out, but he didn't need to. The vehicle slowed, then came to a stop. The driver, a weathered man in a hat, jumped out, his eyes widening. Jesus, kid, you look half dead. Mark almost laughed. He felt half dead. As the driver rushed to his aid, Mark turned to his savior, the dog, but it was already retreating, backing away toward the dunes. Wait! Mark tried to reach out, but the dog simply stood there, watching him. For a moment, their eyes met, a silent understanding. Then, without a sound, the animal turned and disappeared into the desert. Mark felt a lump rise in his throat. He had no idea where the dog came from or why it helped him, but one thing was certain: he wouldn't have survived without it. As the truck rumbled to life, carrying him toward safety, Mark looked back at the vast, endless sands. Somewhere out there, his rescuer still roamed, a ghost of the desert, and Mark would never forget it.